Anthony Eggert, the program director for the transportation program at the ClimateWorks Foundation. We are a global foundation that works with philanthropic organizations that are dedicated to solving the climate challenge and ensuring a prosperous future. And we take both of those very seriously in terms of we're looking for how do we reduce global climate pollution at a speed and a scale that is consistent with the climate challenge, and do so in a way that actually enhances economic prosperity, opportunity for folks around the world to have access to cleaner air, better mobility, better jobs, etc. And so within my background briefly is I actually started as an automotive engineer a couple decades ago, worked for one of the major US automakers doing both vehicle development and design as well as emissions controls. And then from there, eventually ended up as a government regulator. So I worked for the state of California as a regulator, helping to implement the state's air pollution and climate policies. And then most recently, also did a stint in academia doing some research and some work on policy, and then now working in philanthropy. And of course, our goal is to support folks like yourself and others around the world who are working to implement the solutions to climate change. For the transportation program specifically, historically, we've invested in trying to improve the efficiency of the way we move, both people and goods, as well as shifting from what is currently primarily a fossil-based energy system for transport to one that is based increasingly on renewable energy that dramatically reduces greenhouse gas emissions and other pollutants. And that also, I would say that the biggest piece of that is a shift from oil combustion to clean electric drive, kind of across the board for at least all road transport, two-wheelers, three-wheelers, cars, trucks, buses, etc. And so, so that's basically the gist of what we're up to, and really happy to see the good progress in India as well on this. If we're going to solve the climate challenge, we need to transform both the way that we generate and use power. So for power generation, we need to move increasingly towards things like wind and solar, cleaner forms of power production. And again, it's heartening and encouraging to see that India is taking a leadership role on that. Actually meeting and oftentimes exceeding its fairly bold goals for increased renewable generation. And so that is sort of a core pillar, you might say, of what we're trying to achieve. And within climate philanthropy, that's by far the biggest investment, is to shift the power generation sector. At the same time, for transport, the only way we're going to meet the transport challenge is to shift from oil-based transport towards a system that relies almost predominantly, if not entirely, on renewable generation of fuels. And the most promising of all of the options in that space is electric drive vehicles. And then when you look at what it takes to get to a large, significant, deep penetration within that market, it's going to take us decades. And we really have to start now if we want to have any hope of getting to the next 10, 20, 30 years of the scale of adoption that we need to meet the climate challenge. And so really these things have to go in parallel. They can't be sequenced. We can't wait for one before we start the other. They have to run sort of simultaneously. The good news is that they can be self-reinforcing. They can actually help each other. So one of the really cool things about electric vehicles is that they they can provide a flexible load on the power system that can actually help you integrate renewable generation. They can make renewable power more valuable, and they can actually help you make your grid more resilient. And again, I think there's some work underway in India, certainly in my home state here in California, which has been a leader on a lot of these topics. There's a very strong collaboration between the power, the utilities, and the power generators, and the transportation providers, especially of electric vehicles, and lots of innovative ideas of smart charging, integrating vehicles into demand response programs, using sort of specialized rates to encourage consumers to shift their load to when there's a prevalence of solar power, for example. And so we're just getting started in that space, and the potential is enormous for there to be a really strong synergy between those two markets.
Absolutely. So the other question.
And actually, I should say one other little thing,
sure.
Which I think is not fully appreciated, is that even today on a fossil-based grid, electric vehicles are cleaner, and that's because the powertrain of an electric vehicle is significantly more efficient than a combustion. It's on the order of about 3 times efficient of taking the energy from the battery to the wheels relative to taking gasoline or diesel from the tank to the wheels. And because of that tripling of efficiency, even accounting for upstream emissions, EVs today are cleaner, and they're one of the only products that gets cleaner over time as you clean up the grid. So you actually have an opportunity to deploy vehicles that will actually get cleaner over time, which is sort of the reverse of combustion. They tend to get dirtier as they get operated in the field. Let me see if I can answer that a couple different ways. So yes, the current sort of global number of EVs, is in the few million. Actually, more if you count 2- and 3-wheelers. It's in the hundreds of millions. But predominantly in China. But we're sort of at what a lot of people would call approaching a tipping point in terms of market adoption. And if you're familiar with if you look at sort of past successful adoptions of technologies, cell phones and things like that, they go through this S-curve of adoption. And they start out relatively slow. We had cell phones back in the 80s, and very, very low adoption. And of course, they were quite expensive. And then as the technology improved and they started to achieve a level of performance and cost that allowed for a more rapid market uptake, you see this explosion in adoption. And so that happened in the 90s and 2000s with cell phones, and we're sort of at that, we're approaching that tipping point for electric vehicles. And this is why you're seeing a lot of countries set very, very bold goals. So, now there's nearly over a dozen countries that have set 100% targets for either by or before mid-century to achieve a complete penetration of the market for zero-emission vehicles. And that includes both for sort of personal passenger type vehicles as well as buses and trucks for goods movement. You're seeing companies, including ones in India like Wipro and State Bank of India, basically shifting their procurement priorities to go towards 100% adoption and procurement of electric vehicles. Both those two companies are part of a broader initiative called EV100, which you may be familiar with, where it's now up to 60 companies that have committed to buy over 2.5 million electric vehicles by or before 2030, so in the next 10 years. And so I think all of those are just indicators that we are sort of on the cusp of this tipping point. And it really is an opportunity for India or any country really to be at the forefront of the market, to be able to secure both investments, jobs, and basically market and industrial potential for capturing this market. I'll maybe use a slightly different analogy, which is vehicle batteries using lead acid. Basically every combustion vehicle has a lead acid battery, that they use as a starter for combustion vehicles. And in countries that have established a robust recycling program for lead acid batteries, you see recycling rates that are well in excess of 90%. In fact, in some cases, even 99%. And it's basically through some fairly basic policies, which is, having sort of core, battery recycling requirements, core fees and things like that, that basically provide a financial incentive for people to be able to return and bring back the battery for recycling. And then, of course, you need to establish the infrastructure of recycling centers and the capacity to pull apart the pieces and extract the valuable commodities. And that's going to take some time. And so I think there's sort of a dual role here for government policy to provide some of that direction, and industry leadership, including on the part of the automakers, to help facilitate that. And so I think this is one where, again, it's going to require that collaboration, and it's going to take some years to establish. But because there is some valuation in that battery, there's various things like cobalt, et cetera, that can be extracted. The other opportunity here, which is again being explored, is the idea that when a battery is sort of done with its life within the car, it still actually often has quite a bit of useful capacity. And so some companies now are using that as what they call battery second life reuse opportunities, including on grid storage. And so let's say it has 70% of its initial capacity when it's removed from the car. That then can be repurposed to help with integrating greater amounts of renewables, load balancing to help alleviate grid congestion and things like that in the system. And so all of these we're going to see, I think, an increasing amount of innovation, both on the reuse and the recycling stage. And again, India has a chance to kind of lead on some of that as well. Well, first off, in most global markets that we've looked at, even with the fall in the price of oil, electricity as a fuel is still cheaper. So if you do an apples to apples comparison in terms of how many miles you get out of $1 electricity versus how many miles you get out of $1 of oil, you're still getting more out of electricity. So that actually speaks to how big of an advantage electricity has on cost. And so, but to your point, that delta has been reduced. And so this is where we really need, for the next few years, policy, enabling and supporting policy. And that includes things like incentives. It includes things like support for infrastructure deployment. It includes things like incentives, both for the buyers and the manufacturers and providers of the vehicles. And we think that is necessary for about the next 5 years or so, because at that point, EVs actually become cheaper on first cost than combustion vehicles. And there's any number of studies I can point you to on this, this is also sort of what contributes to that tipping point, which is that once the EVs, which are currently a little bit more expensive on first cost actually drop in price to be below the cost of combustion vehicles, they're going to be more affordable, more profitable, and then we anticipate a real big jump in the demand. And so, but again, that's going to take a little bit of effort. It's going to take some support from government. The low oil prices, I think the other thing to learn, if you look back at history, people say, some people say that this is an unprecedented fall. And certainly the demand drop from COVID is quite significant. But we've gone through these cycles many times in the past. There was a fall from over $100 a barrel down to nearly $20 a barrel in 2014, so only 6 years ago. There was a fall in 2008. There was a fall, back in the early 2000s. And so actually, Amory Lovins from Rocky Mountain Institute just put out a nice article in Forbes where he shows the cycle of oil prices. They fall off a cliff and then they climb back up, and then they fall off a cliff and then they climb back up. And so we don't know what the future of oil prices is to bring, but if history is a guide, it's going to be very volatile. And this is the other advantage of electric vehicles, is that electricity prices historically are much, much more stable over time. And so if you are, whether you're an individual or whether you're a company that is trying to manage their transportation costs, electric vehicles is just a much safer bet. Yeah, no, I think, in fact, arguably the two-wheelers were the first to go electric. If you look at China, so in 1997, so 23 years ago, a number of cities in China decided to take the action of prohibiting combustion two-wheelers within their city jurisdictions. And this was because of pollution concerns and things like that. And over a relatively short period of time, the market for two-wheelers, electric two-wheelers, really took off. And so even as of 5 years ago, you had over 200 million electric two-wheelers operating in China, and over 1,000 manufacturers of electric two-wheelers in China. And so that market, and that was with very little policy support, other than basically the market access. And so so absolutely, I think that the cost of the battery is less. The infrastructure challenge is significantly lower because of the charging rates being significantly less. And so, and again, I think you're seeing evidence of this in India with the three-wheelers, as being a really great first niche. Already in the millions of adoption for that market. I do think, though, maybe I'll just take the opportunity. I think, again, the really nice thing about electrification is that it's really scalable. So the battery cells, especially for the lithium chemistries, can be easily stacked from down to a 1 kilowatt hour up to hundreds of kilowatt hours. And then the motors also can be relatively easily scaled. I mean, there's definitely a different form factor for a two-wheeler versus a bus, but electric motors are quite mature as a technology, highly reliable, very affordable. And so one of the really great, at least from a climate perspective or a pollution perspective generally, the cool thing about electrification is that you can proliferate it across all of your platforms, from two-wheelers up to heavy trucks. So, yeah. I think the idea of only EVs by 2035, so only 5 years later, is actually quite plausible. And again, we're starting to see, the UK government, the British government just announced that for passenger vehicles, they're going to go 100% by 2035. And they're actually debating whether or not to pull that number forward. and other jurisdictions as well are now looking at around the 2035 timeframe as being, again, a reasonable and plausible goal to shift towards 100% zero emissions. I would say in terms of the first movers in this space, it's going to be primarily two-wheelers, three-wheelers, cars, and buses. And then I would even add in commercial delivery. So, China is oftentimes, a leader in this space. You have cities like Shenzhen with over 60,000 zero-emission electric drive delivery vehicles. Most people think of Shenzhen, they have the bus story, which is 16,000, 100% of all their buses are electric. They have even more commercial delivery vehicles, over 60,000. And so I would say those segments could go very, very fast. And I would say certainly by 2035, you could imagine that those segments could go to 100% electric. Once you get to the bigger trucks, the longer haul trucks, it may take a little bit longer. But again, I think predicting the future is difficult, but we can also shape the future. And so I think, the idea that both government leadership on the part of, the key ministries and the key countries that have decided to take a step in this direction can help pull that time frame forward. And then the companies that are both the buyers and the producers of these vehicles are also in a position to help accelerate that transition.